Welcome, everyone. I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, and this is the Stanford Digital Economy Lunch Seminar. Today, we're delighted to have Guy Aridor from Columbia University presenting. Guy is an economics PhD candidate at Columbia. He holds a BA in economics, computer science, and mathematics from Boston University. His research studies competition and regulatory issues in digital markets with a particular focus on the economic aspects of consumer data collection and dissemination. He's worked on projects studying social media, privacy regulations, recommendation systems, and online product experimentation. Today's talk is on drivers of digital attention, evidence from a social media experiment. We welcome questions for Guy. I encourage you to ask any kind of clarifying questions during the first 45 minutes when he'll be presenting. And you can use the Q&A function down there at the bottom of your Zoom screen. After 45 minutes, for the last 15 minutes of the 1 hour session, we'll open it up for broader questions as well, and Guy will take a general Q&A. With that, welcome, Guy. We're delighted to have you here at the Digital Economy Lunch. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eric. Very excited to be here today. So yeah, as Eric said, I'm going to talk about my paper, Drivers of Digital Attention, Evidence from a Social Media Experiment. So when I started this project, I was fascinated by how much time people spend online, and in particular on social media services. So last year, the average American spent nearly 1,300 hours on social media. In any given month, nearly half of the world's population used one of the most popular applications, Facebook. Now, given this prominence in our lives and increased time and attention on a select few of these platforms, there's emerged a broadly global debate thinking about the positive and negative aspects of these services, as well as how we should think about regulation in these kind of markets. And so you open up, The Economist, the New York Times, pick your favorite newspaper or your article. There's continual articles thinking about antitrust questions in this space. And it's not just something in the press or even amongst academics, but agencies like the FTC and the European Commission are actively investigating these kind of markets and rethinking a lot of their merger guidelines in these markets. Now, if you go beneath the surface of a lot of the sort of headlines, one of the core issues in these markets is that consumers pay no prices for these services, and that complicates the usage of a lot of the sort of standard antitrust toolkit. So a lot of the back and forth between regulators and applications like Facebook, or what kinds of products should we think of as being relevant substitutes for a product like Facebook? Now, the second aspect of consumer demand that makes this particularly tricky is people spend vast amounts of time on these services. But usage is usually depicted by pictures such as this, right? Of people being glued to their phones and in a sort of colloquial and psychological sense, potentially addicted to these applications with unclear implications for antitrust and competition policy. And so with that backdrop, what I wanted to do in this paper was to think about characterizing demand for these applications in ways we can think of measuring it. And broadly, my paper is going to try to answer two questions. The first is, what are the sort of relevant substitutes for social media applications, and how does that relate to questions of relevant market definition? And second is, can we quantify sort of more broadly the role that inertia plays in driving consumer demand? And I'll talk about how I'm thinking about this with respect to issues of addiction. And I'm going to use these estimates of demand and talk about relevant issues in antitrust. Now, the first thing when thinking about demand is, there are no prices in these markets, so we have to think a little bit carefully about sort of what's the fundamental unit of demand here. And so what the stance I'm going to take in this paper is thinking of time as the sort of relevant dimension of competition. Okay. Now, this is a quote from the UK's Digital Markets Report, right? Where there's a back and forth between Facebook and the regulators about the extent we should think of applications like Facebook as broadly competing with applications like YouTube, which aren't social media applications, but take up consumers' time and attention, or whether we should think of the relevant set of competitors as being sort of a narrow set of social media applications. Okay. So with that backdrop, what I do in this project is the first thing I want to do is I'm going to run an experiment where I'm going to collect this fundamentally unit of demand in a comprehensive way. Right. So I'm going to have people in the study that I run, install software on their phones, which is going to allow me to monitor how they're spending their time on digital services in a very granular fashion. Okay. Now, since I'm going to be in this world of creating my own data, I'm going to introduce the following variation. So I'm going to use the fact that the way I collect data on the phone is going to be through parental control software. to shut off access to particular applications. And in particular, I'm going to pick a social media application, Instagram, and an entertainment application, YouTube, partially sort of motivated from the slide before. And I'm going to have some variation in the length of the restrictions and make sure that they're pretty long so that there might be some persistent effects from these restrictions. Okay. Now, what am I going to do with the resulting data? So the first thing I'm going to want to do is to understand experimentally, how do people substitute their time? So first, I'm going to give you an interpretation of, how I'm thinking about the kind of variation we're getting from this unavailability. And I'm going to try to relate it to this question of what kind of activities and applications are substitutes to, applications like Instagram and YouTube. Okay. Now, the second thing I'm going to do is use the fact that I'm going to keep tracking people after the restrictions are in place. These restrictions are relatively long, and there's some variation in them to understand whether or not there are persistent effects of these restrictions. Okay. Now, after we finish this more experimental part of the paper, I'm going to conclude by focusing on a demand model for the time and attention of consumers. And the way I'm going to construct this is going to be guided by the results that I find in the sort of experimental part. I'm going to estimate a time usage model with consumer inertia. And the first question I want to answer is how much of the overall usage of these applications comes from this inertia channel? And second, how important is this inertia channel for thinking about relevant issues in antitrust, such as merger assessments? And when I talk about this, I'm going to relate some of the estimates and the interpretation of them to this ongoing debate in these markets about digital addiction and how we should think about it from a policy standpoint. Okay, so to sum up, I'm going to talk today about this project where I comprehensively tracked how people spend their time. I used parental control software to shut off access to particular applications. We're going to experimentally characterize substitution patterns and conclude with a demand model that's going to give us some quantification. Are there any questions at this time about sort of the scope of the project and what I'm going to be talking about today? No? Okay, perfect. So before I get into the details, I want to stay at a relatively high level and just think through for you guys, how I'm thinking about the kind of variation that we're generating in here and how it's going to be useful for thinking about questions of demand and how it relates to the sort of way we think about antitrust. So in most typical markets, we really try to characterize substitution with respect to price changes, right? So we observe, through some natural experiment or whatever means, sort of there's some changes in price, and we characterize how consumers substitute with respect to these price changes. Here, what we're trying to explore is what can we learn from experimentally generated unavailability, right? So the first is, I'm going to use the restriction period to understand, how people substitute during the restriction period. And second, I'm going to use the fact that these restriction lengths are long to sort of parse out this inertia channel. Okay. Now, in particular, you might ask the question of, how can we think about, especially this first part, relating to sort of more standard measures of price substitution with respect to price variation. So one interpretation of this, which has been taken by some of the legal scholarship and in some parts of the economics literature, is, even though there are no prices here, if we're thinking of the relevant unit of demand as being, consumers' time and attention, you can think of firms as sort of setting various sort of attention costs as being the relevant price. And the one I'm mainly going to think about is sort of the advertising load, right? So you can think, Facebook is free for consumers, but Facebook sets some advertising load for consumers. And so, by setting sort of a higher advertising load for these consumers, it's in somewhat a price on the time and attention of consumers. Okay. Now you might ask, given that formulation of thinking of, attention costs or the advertising load as being the relevant price, the kind of ideal experiment we want to run would be to just randomize these attention costs or advertising load across consumers, right? So we get a bunch of people, we sort of control how much ads they see, and we can characterize how that changes their time allocations. And in most markets, the ideal experiment we want to run would be, we got access to a firm and we could just randomize the prices observed by consumers. Okay. Now, you can view the kind of variation that I'm generating here as in some sense, one being, in some sense an upper bound on this, but also being more feasible across a broad class of digital goods and without requiring direct collaboration with the firm, right? So we can think of the kind of unavailability variation as coming from, you're in the control group, you have access to your Facebook and face the current market prices. I'm in the treatment group and I have my Facebook taken away. And it's as if I'm sort of acting like Facebook had moved the advertising load to be so high so that I wouldn't use this application. And we can characterize how people substitute at this much higher price. And this is going to give us a relatively conservative answer to the question of, should we view, something like a YouTube as being substitutable with something like a Facebook? So if we don't observe during, the restriction period that people are substituting towards the other class of applications, we wouldn't expect, as in the more traditional sense, substitution if there was a sort of a smaller increase in these advertising loads. Okay. And as sort of a final note, again, this kind of unavailability experimentation is sort of feasible across a broad class of digital goods and something that's sort of harder to run in other markets. But for digital goods, because you have some version of Facebook, I have some version of Facebook, we can run this class of experiments. Okay. Are there any questions at this point about this?
Nope.
No? Okay, cool.
All right.
So to briefly talk about some related work. So, there's a growing literature in economics sort of thinking about economic aspects of social media services, right? And in particular, Eric's paper with Abe Collis and Felix Eggers tries to, use these kind of experimentation tools to sort of measure welfare in these kind of markets, right? So again, we don't have prices, but, digital goods lend themselves to these kind of unavailability experiments, and we can use this, to measure what's the surplus that people actually get from these services. Here, I'm going to exploit this idea and try to use it to think about questions of consumer demand that have also been problematic for regulators in these kind of markets. Okay. The second set of papers I broadly term as looking at inertia effects in demand studies. And there's some earlier work looking at broadly inertia in the usage of digital services. Probably the most relevant is this fascinating paper that's concurrent to mine by Hunt Alcott, Matt Genskow, and Lena Song, which runs a similar kind of study, collecting data on how people spend their time with a bit of a different experimental design, broadly focused on really teasing out, addiction to the class of social media applications as opposed to understanding substitution patterns. And here I'm going to rely on my product and availability variation to identify the role of this inertia. Okay. Cool. So let me talk to you a little bit about the data collection and the experiment. So I'm going to recruit nearly 400 people from a number of university lab pools. So from the lab pool from Chicago Booth, NYU, Columbia, HKUST, and a very small handful from Facebook advertisements. Now, you naturally sort of think, I'm recruiting from these university lab pools, so there's going to be some natural selection on demographics here. So my participants in the study are going to be relatively young, with an average age of 26. But there's various reasons to rely on these university lab pools for these kind of studies. The incentives for completing the study are, there's going to be a baseline $50 that participants are going to receive for keeping the restrictions in place or keeping the software on their phones and answering surveys. And then similar to some of the existing literature, they're going to have the potential at sort of as a secondary restriction at the very end of the study to earn additional money according to their evaluation for giving up these applications. But this won't factor too much in the analysis, but it's important for understanding the incentives for participants to participate in the study. The software I'm going to use is, I'm going to use Android parental control software. So, my sample is only going to include Android users, and I'm going to have a Chrome extension that I make that people install on their computers, which is going to let me monitor how they're spending time on the computer. Okay. Now, what's the timeline of the study? So the main data collection runs for a period of 5 weeks, where it starts with we meet everyone on Zoom. They set up the applications beforehand, and we have them ask any questions that they have about the study, make sure that the software is set up accordingly. The main data collection runs for a period of 5 weeks. There's a baseline period of 1 week with no restriction. After that week, people are either restricted from YouTube, Instagram, or control. And then there's some time afterwards where people are no longer restricted. Now, importantly, participants don't actually know which particular applications are going to be restricted beyond the fact that it's going to be some sort of non-essential social media entertainment application. So people don't find out until the end of the baseline week which application they're going to have restricted and for how long. And yeah, so this makes it so there's no possible anticipatory effects. Okay. Now, to walk you through a little bit more carefully, sort of the flow of people through the study. So, when we're doing recruitment, there's a potential worry with this kind of study that you don't want to necessarily have, people that are entering into the study that, want to reduce their social media services, for instance. And so in the recruitment, we basically send out recruitment documents saying we're interested in how people spend their time on digital services, and you're going to have some application restricted. So 553 people express interest. There's some time between, coordinating between these lab pools. So some month passes. And then in the end, we have 410 people that end up showing up to the Zoom and completing the baseline survey. Now, given that we're using Android software here, there's a wide variety of Android phones. So roughly 21 participants have Android phones that don't agree with the software. So we end up with the base sample of 389 participants. Now, again, there's sort of no requirement that the participants use, Instagram or YouTube. And so we condition on this set of 374 participants that use either Instagram or YouTube, and block randomize according to the baseline usage, so that people are either in the Instagram group, the YouTube group, and the control group. Now, this block randomization is important to make sure that there's a balanced usage across the different groups in terms of usage of Instagram, YouTube, and the core set of social media applications that we care about. Okay. Then after that, there's a uniformly random people are either assigned to be in the 1 or 2 week restriction group. And the final thing to know about the flow through the study is that questions of attrition. And so we don't have too much attrition that's selected on treatment. So 2 people drop from the control group, 2 people drop from the YouTube group, and 4 people drop from the Instagram group, usually coming from people getting an iPhone or being tired of surveys. And so we don't have to worry about it too much when thinking about the analysis. Okay, so this is an overview of sort of the experimental timeline and the randomization. Are there any questions at this time from anyone? Any clarifying questions about any aspect of the study? Nothing in the Q&A?
Nope.
Okay. Cool.
I encourage people, if you have questions, please feel free to put it right in the Q&A, and I'll pass it on.
Yeah, happy to answer any clarifying questions that people have about any aspect. Okay, so let me talk a little bit then about the time data collection. So you're going to use parental control software for the phone. So I think this is pretty cool. So basically, parental control software doesn't naturally scale to 400 people. So there's some number of parental control accounts that we run that are you can log in and sort of see when people were last active on different devices. You can see session-based data on how people spend their time, as well as aggregates at a daily level, as well as, for instance, when people install new applications and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, this gives me really granular data on minute by minute phone usage of all the applications that people use on their phone. Okay. Now, in order to provide some discipline to sort of understanding substitution patterns, there's some thousands of applications, and to sort of approximate, this notion that I talked about before of sort of thinking of, product categories as being the sort of relevant dimension of substitution, I'm going to manually pair all the applications I observe with the application category, the applications assigned to in the Google Play Store. Okay. Now, in terms of how the restrictions are implemented, so the parental control software makes it so that participants are, when they open up Instagram, it says you should go and talk to your parents about getting Instagram back. So it sort of shuts off the application itself, but it also shuts off, any HTTP requests to the domains that people can't, at least on the phone, substitute to the different browsers. Okay. And, parental control software is sort of built with adversarial mindset. So, kids usually want to get this off their phone. So there's pretty stringent security guidelines to make it so that the people can evade the restrictions. Okay.
So can you say a little bit more about that and just flesh out? You allowed them to substitute to other devices to some extent. You've got the Chrome extension. There you go. So tell us a little bit about that.
Perfect. Yeah, so the restrictions are on the phone. Now, I won't show them in the talk, but if you look in the paper, there's descriptives for how much time people spend in the baseline. So for most of the applications of interest, they're spending most of the time on the phone. Now, of course, they're going to be able to substitute cross devices. And so there's two ways that we're going to pick up the substitution. So the first is that I make a Chrome extension that runs in runs in Chrome and works in a similar kind of way, where it sort of continually monitors sort of what's focused on the screen. And there's some nuance to sort of measuring time allocation.
So you wrote this Chrome extension?
Yeah, so there's a lot of open source stuff that I sort of pieced together, and I have a server on the back end. It's very simple Flask application that collects the time that people are spending. So most of for the parental control software, I have Selenium scripts that sort of scrape the web interface of the parental control software. Here I have the Chrome extension with the server and database that I run. This is on my GitHub if people want to use it for future studies.
It doesn't block it, it just records it. So you keep track of it?
It just records it, yeah. So it just records it mainly because, one important consideration to think about here is, of course, if you're only collecting data on Chrome, it's much easier to substitute across different browsers. And so this is something that, for instance, when we did the setup period, we basically asked people if Chrome was their main browser, and we made it very clear that they would be able to substitute to their computer. And so they have no reason during the restrictions to sort of deviate across the web browsers. And so this gives us a good measure of sort of how people are spending time on their computer, both more broadly, but especially during the restriction period. Now, a natural question could be that, okay, well, what if I use it on my tablet or something like this? And
right.
So,
in fact, that's what David Lang in the Q&A is asking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So, right. So the second way that we sort of can monitor the sort of cross-device substitution is through weekly time use surveys. And so here we're relying a little bit more on subjective time assessments. And so every week, people get a survey that asks them how much time they spent on YouTube and Instagram on non-phone devices. And it's sort of, the survey is made very clear to sort of log non-phone devices. And so we're going to be able to say something about, how much quantitatively are people substituting towards the computer using the sort of more objective Chrome extension data, and then something more subjectively about the substitution using the weekly time use surveys.
And how well do those data sources match up when they say that they're using Facebook or not using Facebook? Is that consistent with what you see in the Chrome data?
Yeah, so well, we can talk about the experimental results in a bit. So there's some subtleties with respect to the experimental week. So I think the best comparison though is in the baseline week, and sort of consistent with some of the existing work that tries to. So there was a study by people at Facebook that they observe obviously the time that people spend on Facebook, and they sort of recruit a bunch of people to get subjective time-based assessments. So they seem to find that it's correlated, but there is still some measurement error. So here, the best comparison is in my baseline period. Sort of I can see how people in the baseline survey think they're spending their time and how that relates to sort of the baseline usage. And I find that there's a strong correlation, but there is some mismeasurement on the side of participants.
Got you. And as long as we're on this topic, Ross Dalke asks, why did you choose to make your own Chrome extension as opposed to using something like Web Historian? Do you know about Web Historian?
So yeah, the reason to do that is there's with the data collection, there's sort of two things, right? The first is actually collecting the data, and the second is making it come to me in sort of a relatively easy format. So for the parental control software, I'm able to use the sort of parent's web interface. I couldn't really find something equivalent as that for the Chrome extension. So the easiest thing was just to make my own and sort of run my own server for it. So I control the data collection for it. That also gives me some flexibility. So I don't talk about it here, but basically, this gives me, I add some privacy controls for participants. So I make it so that it only logs time on sort of a core set of websites, and participants can sort of toggle if they want me to see everything. Because especially for the Chrome extension, I mainly want to use it to understand, how people are substituting towards services like YouTube or Instagram when it's blocked on their phone. So I get that additional dimension because I can sort of control
it. Great. Okay. I know you have other results you want to present. So
yeah. Okay, let's move on. So I'll just very quickly go through the descriptive stats. So people spend a lot of time on their phone. They spend a lot of time on social media applications. So there's an extensive multi-homing where there's people use a lot of the set of applications like Facebook, YouTube, etc. you can, correlate their valuations with time, and you find a pretty robust positive correlation between the welfare measures and time. But of course, I listed a measure of psychological addiction, and there's a large fraction of people that, in a psychological sense are addicted to these services. Okay. So that overview is the sort of experimental description and sort of some descriptive stats on the data. Now, let me move into some of the experimental results. So the first thing that I want to do is, again, in this sort of relevant substitutes question, I really want to understand, to what extent are people mainly substituting their time towards other services similar to applications like Facebook, or towards social applications, or broadly towards sort of entertainment or communication applications. And so I'm going to characterize how people substitute their time during this restriction period. And so the first thing I find is that, in both treatments, there's a substantial reduction in own category time. So if we look at the usage of sort of the bundle of social applications or the bundle of entertainment applications, there's going to be a no perfect substitution, for instance, during the Instagram restrictions towards other applications like Facebook and TikTok and so on. Okay. However, there is, I have a sort of a second result where we look at, this sort of substitution towards sort of other social applications, right? So if we look at the bundle of time spent on social applications, excluding YouTube, comparing it in the treatment to the control group, there's going to be, roughly a 22% increase in the time spent on these other applications. Okay. Now, the more interesting question is, is there a substitution across product categories, right? So if you think about the sort of question the thing I showed you at the beginning of the talk, do we observe that people are substituting from applications like YouTube towards applications like Facebook, and vice versa? And so I find evidence for one direction of this, right? So I find that people substitute during the restriction period from an application like YouTube towards sort of things in the social category, right? Towards applications like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Now, I find some asymmetry, right? Where basically for the Instagram treatment, I don't find that people actually, substitute towards entertainment applications, but rather, I find some evidence that they substitute towards communication applications, right? So I do observe, some cross-category substitution with some meaningful asymmetry. And, this obviously leads to the question of, should we be thinking about, different application categories as really characterizing, the uses of these applications, right? So YouTube is an entertainment application, Instagram is a social application, but there's sort of an intuitive sense that, this doesn't fully capture how people use this application.
When you say those applications, that's as categorized not by you, but by Google, right?
Yeah, in the Google Play Store, exactly.
But
and
yeah,
so,
you could have you do have like a whole matrix of substitution.
Yeah, exactly. So as part of the baseline survey, one thing that I elicit is basically, again, consistent with his intuition that people have various ways to use these applications. So I asked, for this core set of applications, do people mainly use it for, entertainment purposes, where entertainment is sort of defined in terms of watching videos or memes or whatever, social purposes, where this is sort of passively keeping up with your friends, directly communicating with your friends, getting information, where getting information is sort of broadly defined as, not just political news, but also, acquiring some sort of niche informational content. So this could be like, getting economics papers or something like this. And roughly what you find is that, for applications like Netflix and YouTube, the subjective uses is mainly aligned with sort of the category from the Google Play Store of entertainment. However, for these more social media applications, there's a lot of heterogeneity, right? So people that use TikTok, mainly use it for entertainment purposes, Twitter mainly for getting information, Facebook and Instagram, for a wide heterogeneous usage of these applications, right? And the sort of broader point here is, when we're thinking about this question of relevant substitutes, the sort of more typical way of doing this would be to look at these more revealed preference measures of substitution, but regulators are sort of, defaulted towards using product categories and product characteristics as a way of sort of assessing substitution patterns. And so my results sort of point to the fact that, for these kind of markets, you might observe these kind of asymmetric substitution patterns because people have, heterogeneous ways that they use these applications.
And I mean, you could put them into these categories like entertainment, communication, etc., or you could just be completely data driven and just say, here's the substitution between application A and application B, and who cares what label we give it.
Exactly. And so I'll do this a little bit when we look at the demand model, but I think, again, the broader point is, again, that the sort of default to using these product characteristics is likely to be insufficient in characterizing these things. In most markets, we wouldn't have this sort of way of looking at it, right? We would just look at some price increase and understand substitution patterns with respect to that. And so here, there's reasons to think that we should do something similar, and these categories aren't going to characterize what we would see in that case. Now, I'll just conclude on that part. You might ask the question of, okay, so suppose we wanted to define sort of so one typical reason to understand these relevant substitutes is to define relevant markets, which we can then use to sort of measure market share and allow us to measure market concentration. And so, you can use this kind of cross-category substitution and, define markets according to these multi-categories. And there's going to be some meaningful difference in the sort of estimates of market concentration.
And just to walk, and everyone here is an economist. So yeah. If two things are strong substitutes for each other, you'd consider them to be sort of in the same market. And if there were a merger between them, that would increase market power. Whereas if two things are not substitutes, then there may be no effect on competition because they're not really alternatives to each other. So that's an important empirical question.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I won't talk about it too much today, but there will be a more concrete sense of this when you do the mergers in my paper in particular. Now, the final thing I'll talk about before we move to sort of the post-restriction substitution is this question that we talked about, is there a change in the overall usage of digital devices? And so, there's a reduction in phone usage, both for YouTube and Instagram. It's a little bit bigger in Instagram. But, somewhat surprisingly, there isn't too much evidence for cross-device substitution, right? So using the Chrome extension, so on the baseline, people are spending nearly 30 minutes a day on Instagram and nearly 50 minutes a day on YouTube. The Chrome extension measures sort of a 1-minute increase of Instagram time on the computer and roughly a 9-minute increase on YouTube time, right? So there isn't too much cross-device substitution. And the surveys point to, if anything, people perceive to have reduced their time sort of across different devices, according to the survey.
We can even imagine a story where there's complementarity. If you see a video, or like suppose you're watching a training video like that teaches you something on your phone, you might continue to watch it on your Chrome extension. So you could even imagine that it would increase. So maybe a combination of some substitution, but also some complementarity, and those kind of partly cancel out.
Yeah, exactly. So here we're just characterizing sort of a reduced form of time substitution. And yeah, it doesn't appear as though, there's some perfect substitution, which could be explained by a number of things. One of them, which is, that there's some mixed substitutability and complementarity that pushes down the time allocation.
There are two comments from David Lang here. Let me pass them on to you. First off, he points to a URL, we'll save that for you, on GitHub with something called Habit Lab that has a bunch of tools available for like monitoring your behavior and setting interventions and watching progress that may be related to the kinds of stuff you've developed and be useful in follow-on work. And to any of the participants here might find it useful. And then secondly, he asked if there's any inframarginal changes, like speeding up YouTube videos.
That could be interesting. Can we talk about that later though? So I want to get through a couple more things in the talk.
Sure. Well, let me just ask one more question. And sorry, without I know you like Yorgos Petropoulos. We were talking about substitution. I think is appropriate here. He asked, I don't know the answer to this. Is there a threshold of value for substitution that formally defines whether apps are in the same market?
Right. So that's a good question. So here I'm taking a very conservative approach to this, right? So basically the more typical approach is something called like a SNP or a SNP test, right? Where you would basically, have this be an iterative procedure. Here, I'm just thinking of, because I'm using this more conservative intervention where we're really thinking of, we're moving the price to some infinite value. I just want to understand, is there any substitution that we observe? And, when I'm doing this market definition exercise, I'm basically saying, let's define the market in terms of sort of any substitution that we observe. So this is like a really conservative way of sort of doing this market definition question. But we can talk about that a lot more in the end of the talk, because there's some details there.
But there's no like formal threshold that if it's more than 10% or 20% or 50% substitution that you would call it the same market. That there's no such number as that.
Yeah. So here, right. So here I'm using So there are ways to do this. So you're using the sort of snake test here. I'm just asking the question if there's a meaningful substitution where I sort of informal thing of like roughly 10%. So I keep seeing somebody's raising their hand. Okay. But yeah, so we can talk about that a little bit later. I want to get through some.
Sure, yeah, go ahead and finish. Then we'll have in about 8 minutes, we'll open up to broader questions or roughly in that time frame. Yeah.
So let me walk through the sort of more so let's look at the post restriction effects. And so I'm going to think a little bit more carefully about what sort of persistent effect should we expect to see. And so I'm thinking of a relatively informal model where we think of, in every time period T, I'm going to use, I'm engaged in some focal activity. So this could be like, going on the subway, going to class, watching some seminar. And you can think, the main drivers of usage of these applications are either, to alleviate, so-called micro boredom. So sort of fill in some amounts of time that I spend on the, on the subway with spending it on Instagram or Facebook, or seeking out specific kinds of information, right? So looking up specific videos or specific profiles. So you might think that the restriction by sort of, by removing access to your application, the kind of things that you turn to on your phone, you might change your habits. And so we might think that the restrictions themselves have some persistent effects on the usage of the restricted and other applications, which is larger for the 2-week group relative to the 1-week group. We might think that, by restricting an application, there might be some intertemporal substitution where sort of if I was looking up a particular profile, I might intertemporally substitute that so that if I was looking something up on a Wednesday, I might substitute to using it on a Saturday, which would manifest itself by sort of a spike in usage when the application comes back. Now, I'm just going to show you for now sort of a moving average of the time series of usage of each of these applications, right? So this is in Instagram, this is in YouTube. And so the black line here is the control group. The red line is the 1-week restriction group for Instagram. And the blue line is the 2-week restriction group for Instagram. And here is a similar sort of time series for YouTube. Now, do the statistical analysis on the next slide, but just staring at this, there's sort of 2 things that are apparent, right? The first is that there's not a spike in usage on the day that the application comes back. And the second is that there's sort of a persistent reduction, especially for the 2-week group. Okay. Now, you can put this through, the more statistical formulation. You find that, there's roughly a 5-minute reduction in Instagram usage for the 2-week group, one relative to the 1-week group, but also relative to the control group. Now,
can you help us quantify that? That's how much time did they use Instagram before? So what percentage reduction?
Yeah, so the baseline was 30 minutes, right? So this is a sizable percentage reduction in overall usage. Now, a natural question is sort of what's driving this, right? So you can estimate something known as a Quantile treatment effect, which will basically allow you to understand how this varies across the distribution, and sort of consistent with intuition that you might think, especially if it's this habit channel that's driving the reduction in usage, it's mainly the most intense users that have the reduction. I find that the upper deciles of usage are really the things that are driving the sort of average treatment effect, right? So people that were very intense users of the application before are the ones that are more likely to sort of have reduced post-restriction usage. Okay. Now, this last thing is you might ask the question of, okay, so we've monitored this for 2 weeks, how persistent are these kind of effects? So I send a survey 1 month after the experiment, and people self-report that they're continuing to spend less time on Instagram relative to the control group. So these effects seem to be somewhat persistent.
Did you notice a difference in the first week versus the second week, or over the 2-week period that the day 1 versus day 14, or day 7 versus 14?
Yeah, so I don't estimate this time varying, but it does. I mean, if you look at the time series, it looks pretty consistent, where it's sort of there isn't sort of it's not that most of this comes from the first week that sort of reduces a little bit after the second week. It seems pretty constant, but I don't measure time varying treatment effects here, so that's just based on the graphs from before. Okay, and then so there's sorry, I keep seeing that somebody's raising their hand. anyways, there's a similar effect for YouTube, but it's a little bit more imprecise. Now, you can also ask whether or not there's sort of substitution towards other applications. And so one interesting thing that this kind of data collection actually enables is, I can actually observe, when people install applications, right? And this is, in economics, at least an important aspect of consumer inertia. And for YouTube in particular, I find that, people in the YouTube restriction sort of would actively seek out, install and spend time on applications that they installed during this period and persist to use them afterwards, okay? Now, I want to take these results to sort of motivate the demand model that I'm probably not going to get to talk to, but the main results that I find here, roughly, there's signs of broadly consumer inertia that drive the usage of these applications, right? So the first is, this sort of result on people spending more time on newly installed applications is consistent with the idea that sort of the fact that they had YouTube sort of prevented them from sort of searching out and finding new applications that they could spend their time on. Second, the sort of persistent reductions in usage, especially for this 2-week group, come from, are indicative of some sort of habit formation that sort of, the restrictions, change the habits of participants. Now, what I guess I won't talk about too much, but for the rest of the talk, the idea is to sort of take these more
go ahead and take a little more time. I think it's fine if you want to go a bit.
Okay, yeah, I'll give a high level overview of the demand model without the details. So I'm gonna produce, as we talked about with Eric, sort of direct estimates of substitution between applications. So I'm gonna estimate, a demand model that's gonna get me diversion between Facebook and Instagram in particular, right? Then I'm going to want to sort of quantify the role of this inertia and usage and conclude with a merger analysis, okay? Now, I'll give a super high level overview of the demand model. And so here, what I'm going to do is, thinking about this sort of more informal model we were talking about before, where like in every time period, a user is going to use some application. Now, I'm going to make 2 assumptions. The first is, there's going to be some sort of myopia, which means that like only the utility I get from using Facebook today is going to matter for my decision about whether or not to use Facebook. However, if I'm my habitual usage is going to play a role. So I'm going to model this in a sort of similar way that's done in sort of the state-dependent demand estimation literature in economics, where past usage is going to directly factor into current period utility. And sort of the challenge is going to be to disentangle the sort of past usage component from, my inherent preferences for using an application like Facebook. Okay, and I'm going to restrict myself to sort of prominent social media applications. So I'm going to estimate this demand model for, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Reddit, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. And then we're going to consider sort of the outside option as basically being any applications on the phone or any non-digital activities. Okay. Now, I'm going to have some utility specification that's basically, the details of this, aren't too important, but the rough idea is going to be, past usage is going to factor into consumer period utility. There's going to be, I'm going to try to capture the different preference heterogeneity of consumers through a number of ways. But mainly, I'm going to rely on sort of the experiment to introduce variation to the habits of consumers that's going to allow me to sort of parse out sort of what comes from the sort of more longer term inertia channel, okay? Now, one important thing I want to know on this without going into too much of the technical details is the way I model this sort of tries to remain agnostic as to what are the possible behavioral mechanisms that drive this kind of inertia effect, right? And so, I'm going to model this by having past usage directly into factor into consumer period utility is sort of going to allow me to remain agnostic as to what mechanisms are really driving this, okay?
Although it's a super important question to disentangle that going forward, I guess.
So yeah, I think it's important to disentangle it. And so one interpretation I'll give of it is you could also think of it as, one, I think it's important to understand, what are the different breakdown of the different behavioral mechanisms. But you can also view this as really upper bounding, the extent to which this comes from issues relating to addiction questions, right? And so the main kind of counterfactual I'm going to try to look at is we can shut off this longer term inertia channel. And in some sense, it's going to give us an upper bound on the extent to which, usage of these applications comes from sort of addictive considerations. And this is going to be important when we look at the merger analysis, because effectively the question there is going to be, there is an active debate about, these digital addiction policies, usually from a more sort of welfare point of view, right? Just thinking of addiction as per se being a bad thing. Here, one thing I'm thinking about is, the extent to which these, digital addiction policies can actually be used from a sort of more antitrust perspective, right? As sort of a sort of less heavy-handed way for regulators to sort of promote competition in these markets by targeting these aspects of the features and stuff of these applications that contribute to these addiction issues. Okay. So yeah, so I'm going to get some estimates for the model. I validate that it's able to match sort of how people spend their time and predict substitution patterns. I'm going to produce, some matrix of substitution patterns, right? So the numbers aren't super important, but the model is going to be able to produce, a matrix of substitution patterns, for instance, from Instagram to all other applications. And this is the main output I'm going to take from the model. And again, the main counterfactual I'm going to run here is asking the questions of sort of what happens if this longer term inertia channel is shut down. And so in particular here, I'm going to shut down the sort of longer term inertia channel and set it equal to 0. And, as I discussed, you can think of this as sort of being a limit case on the role of these sort of policies aimed at curbing digital addiction. And what am I going to find when I do this? So first is the sort of overall usage of the set of considered applications is going to drop by nearly 40%, right? So if we take the basket of usage of the applications that I consider, which are sort of the core social media entertainment applications, this is going to drop by nearly 40%. Now, there's going to be, it's not that when we characterize this matrix of substitution patterns, it's not that there's going to be sort of a uniform drop. There's going to be a drop in sort of the substitution, especially towards these larger applications. But some of the relatively smaller applications actually might have some sort of increased diversion. Okay. Now, we have this model. It's going to give us outputs of substitution patterns with this inertia channel on, with this inertia channel off. And in the final part of the paper, which I won't talk about too much, I'm going to do some merger analysis between these applications and just ask the question of, is there a meaningful difference in the kind of mergers that we would block with this inertia channel on and with it off? And the broader punchline is, yes, it does appear as though there will be the sort of the change in substitution patterns between applications meaningfully changes the set of mergers that we block. Okay. So I'll conclude on that front. So what
you want you to say another sentence or two about that? What are some of the types of mergers that would be more likely to be blocked or less likely to be blocked if you consider it?
Yeah, very good. So it's mainly going to be mergers between especially sort of relatively smaller applications and larger applications, right? And so the intuition, without going into too many of the details, is the merger framework is going to think of the relevant price here as being advertising load. And so this inertia channel basically makes it so that, let's think of a merger between, let's say, a Snapchat and Instagram. Okay. Now, by bumping up the advertising load of Snapchat, when there is the inertia channels on, there's a large diversion towards applications like Instagram, which allows the sort of joint firm to internalize a lot of the substitution. Okay. Now, whenever we move to the no inertia counterfactual, sort of the diversion, especially to these larger applications, drops by a lot, which basically makes it so that these mergers are less likely to be blocked when we sort of move to this no inertia counterfactual, because there's a meaningful change in the diversion towards these applications. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm happy to chat about more depth during the Q&A if people are interested in going through it. So to conclude, what do we do today? So basically, I told you about this experiment I ran collecting data on how people spend their time. I shut off access to popular mobile phone applications using parental control software. The sort of main experimental results are, these relatively dispersed experiment substitution patterns, some reduced form evidence for things broadly consistent with consumer inertia. I estimated a quantitative demand model of time, found that inertia accounts for a large fraction of usage of these applications. And then, I showed that, that this inertia channel was quantitatively large enough to actually influence, merger assessments. Okay. And so what I want you to walk away from this sort of taking away. So the first is that I think, these kind of product and availability experiments are, very feasible for a large class of digital goods. And I think they're a very useful way for, regulators and firms to think about characterizing demand for their applications. And I think there's a very wide value of these kind of experiments. And I hope I've showed that through my study. The second is that, when we're thinking about this question of relevant substitutes, these product categories are likely to be insufficient for thinking about, the sets of relevant substitutes. And finally, this last exercise I did, I hope sort of makes the point that these digital addiction policies that are currently being debated from a more sort of welfare perspective are broadly useful as sort of an antitrust tool when thinking about promoting competition in these markets. So happy to take more questions. I know I went a little bit over the allotted time. So
thanks. Well, that was terrific, and I encourage participants to put your questions in the Q&A function. There are several there already. So let me combine two of them that are closely related. Namita Sharma asks, did you consider other variables such as socio-demographic variables, gender, age, occupation, or others, as well as such as the length of the mobile or internet subscription? And then Matthew Riot asks, first he says, great research. And he says, I'm curious what your thoughts are about how repeatable these results are across other demographics, cultures, and other variables that can influence. So I know you have some variables like that. Can you say a little bit about what you learned from those?
Yeah, so great question. Yeah, so one of the aspects of recruiting from the university lab pools, I'm speaking about the demographics that I'm selecting from there. So it's a little bit hard for me to extrapolate that much beyond it. Now, if you look at, and so I think the issue there would effectively be, my suspicion is that the more qualitative results from the study would hold in other settings. The quantitative results might change a little bit, right? The extent of diversion between like Facebook and Instagram in particular might vary if I change the set of people that I'm running this on. But I think the broader intuition of sort of the relevant substitutes is sort of being broader beyond just the set of product categories, and inertia being a quantitatively important channel. I would be shocked, at least if you ran this in a different setting and you got wildly different conclusions on this front. And I think it would be fascinating to run a larger scale sort of study, doing this across a wide range of goods as well as sort of demographics as well. So,
great. Thanks. And then Alex Parkhamenko asks about messaging and I think I'm not sure exactly what his question is, but I think it has to do with, there's when people are messaging you, you sort of have to answer them, and there's sort of an aspect of that network effects, for instance.
Yeah, so this is a great question. So yeah, I think for these class of applications, this is something in the experimental design thought about a lot, right? So it's using communication applications as one of the restrictions. So for these applications, network effects matter a lot, right? And so people, the particular people that are messaging with, that's going to drive a lot of the usage. And so this is one of the reasons for this kind of study not to use these applications. Now, you do have some. Don't you also have in the survey some questions about the number of connections they have, and you could quantify how important network effects are to some. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, one thing I could do is for this set of applications, quantify the extent of network effects. And that gets a lot to antitrust as well. There's arguments that you might want to treat network goods differently than other kinds of goods in terms of the inherent economies of scale from those. Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, one thing to think about with this kind of study is especially in the sort of second exercise, I can control for these network effects to some extent, but one question is the kind of diversion ratios I'm going to estimate are going to be lower bounds on what we expect the sort of true diversion ratios to be, because we expect, if I shut off Instagram forever, there might be some sort of shift in the network that happens as a result that that's going to be hard to account for in this kind of study. Right. And so, yeah, we found that, we looked at WhatsApp and we found phenomenally higher values, for instance, in the Netherlands, the United States. I think there's a network focal point there that for some people using it in certain groups or cultures versus others. And it's not the features of the product per se, it's which other people are using it that matters. Yeah. And especially for WhatsApp, I think this is a big deal. if you have a chance to look at the paper, there's a fascinating set of survey responses from people at the end, where, you know, at the very end of the study, we sort of asked them how they felt they responded to the different restrictions. And some of the people that, for instance, use Instagram for some communication purposes, you know, were like, I didn't message my friends for the 2 weeks of the study. So yeah, but there's some interesting surveys, survey answers that I encourage you to check out on this front.
And Niels Wernerfeld asks, if apps have learning curves, if they have some adjustment costs, how would that be different? You know, how would you interpret that versus inertia? Or is that, I guess that's part of it.
So yeah, so that's a great question. So this is one of the reasons why I take this particular kind of modeling approach in the demand model, right? Is because, you know, there's a lot of possible elements of dynamics that we want to think about here. It could be, you know, some form of habit formation, some sort of switching costs. It could be that I have to pay some sort of, you know, investment costs to sort of start up with these other applications. And, you know, one of the benefits of this modeling approach is to try to remain agnostic as to sort of what are the behavioral mechanisms that are really driving it. So if you just look at the experimental results that I have, you know, one of them suggests that habit formation might be a possible aspect. And the second is, you know, that there's some sort of search and inattention aspect of usage. Now, on this front of sort of actively investing in applications, so, you know, I didn't talk about it in the talk, but in the study, you know, there's one question I ask at the end about the extent to which, you know, people substituted applications that they had on their phones and actively sort of invested in it, where that could be, you know, following more people or learning about new features. And some participants self-reported that they did this during the study period. So I don't necessarily quantify it, but, you know, there's some evidence that participants felt that they did this during the study.
But just to highlight that, I mean, the word digital addiction has a pretty negative connotation. On the other hand, learning, I mean, some of these apps, YouTube has all these how-to apps that I didn't know about until I played around. And now there's, like, I found that there's thousands of really cool how-to apps that I learned. And you could imagine that once you learn about these things, you end up spending a lot more time on that app or Facebook or Instagram. They all have things that you learn about that enhance utility. And that would have sort of the opposite, I think, welfare implications as digital addiction. So
yeah,
I know you're pretty agnostic to it in this paper, but it seems like going forward, it would be pretty useful to distinguish whether it's a welfare gain or welfare loss to have these inertia effects.
Yeah, so exactly. So, I mean, again, this is, I mean, one of the reasons why, you know, in the paper, you know, I'm very agnostic to questions of welfare is in particular because there's different aspects of inertia that, you know, as you stated, some might actually be, you know, more positive from a welfare perspective, others might be negative. And so by disentangling these behavioral mechanisms, you can make, you know, more fine-grained welfare statements of that regard. So I don't do that in the paper, but I think it's obviously a fascinating area of work to be done in the future. So.
Great. Well, we're basically out of time. I'll leave you with the last word. If there are things that you maybe want to say about where you're going next with this line of research, or what you see as the implications or next steps.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of issues, especially in these kind of markets that we don't understand, using a lot of the more standard toolkit. I think these kind of unavailability experiments are useful, not just for thinking about welfare, but thinking about, you know, characterizing a lot of different aspects of demand. And one of the cool things of digital services is we can have these really individualized treatments that are really hard to do in other kind of markets. And I think it's, you know, an exciting area of future research.
Yeah, it's great to be able to do this kind of analysis, and you've done it better than anyone I know. So congrats to that. And thank you so much for joining us, Guy, and look forward to continue to follow your research.
Thanks so much.
All right. Well, that's our digital economy seminar for this week. Next week, we have Daniel Rock joining us from the Wharton School. And we look forward to seeing you 1 week for today for that talk. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.